Peace be still. All right. You think you can manage another 30 minutes? Good for you. I'm not sure if I can, but we'll see how we go. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of covenant. This is a very, very important idea. The cultural institution of covenant was used everywhere in the ancient Near East. Virtually all ancient peoples practiced the idea of covenant making because there was no such thing as international law. So covenants became a way of managing the relationship between people groups, between different cities or different nations, and in a personal level between different people, because there was not some sort of institutional law to which people could appeal. And this cultural institution in the ancient world then becomes the basis that God will use for his relationship to his own people. They will be in a covenant relationship. But you do need to understand that the idea of covenant begins not just in the Bible, it is much wider than the Bible throughout the entire ancient Near East. It's a basic social institution within tribal structures and between city-states. This essentially then is a solemn promise, usually given with an oath, that each party agrees to fulfill their obligations to this covenant. Now, there are different kinds of covenants. There are covenants between big kings and little towns called a suzerainty treaty. The treaty of the great king, he basically imposes his treaty upon the people. There are bilateral covenants in which both parties are more or less equal. So you have different types of covenants, but the idea of covenant is very important in the ancient world, especially what is called the suzerainty treaty, which is the covenant between parties of unequal status. This is the covenant between an overlord or a great king and his subjects. Here's a couple of examples. The one on the left is in the British Museum. This is a treaty, a Hittite treaty, and it is from about the time of Moses, even though it's not about Moses at all. And it describes an agreement between the great king and his subjects, and I'm going to show you pieces of that in just a moment, how that works. The other one is a little bit later. It is one of the treaties of Esarhaddon, who was an Assyrian emperor, and this one's at the University of Pennsylvania. But they're very similar in the way they talk about unequal parties in covenant with each other. This is the way the treaty form goes. It starts with a preamble, that is a first paragraph statement. And usually it begins with the term, "These are the words." Interestingly enough, that is exactly the way that the book of Deuteronomy begins. These are the words. Then after the preamble, there is a historical description about the great king's benevolence in the past. In other words, the great king is going to say, I've been good to you for a long time, and so basically it's going to say, you owe me. You need to follow through on this. Then there are the stipulations, the actual obligations that the vassal and the overlord are agreeing to do. The vassal is going to agree to bring tribute, read money, when you read tribute, to the overlord. And the overlord, for his part, is going to agree to protect his vassal. Anybody that attacks you, attacks me, and I'm going after him. So it's a protection issue as well. Then there is a document. The actual treaty is written up. In fact, that's the two documents I showed you were treaty documents that were written. And so this document is going to deposit. Usually there were two copies of this document. There was a document for each of the two parties, and they would deposit these documents in their respective temples. So if you were an Assyrian and your vassal was, say, Aram, the people in Aram would get one copy and they would deposit it in their temple, and the people in Assyria would deposit the other copy in their temple. And there were witnesses. Usually the witnesses were believed to be the gods and goddesses of the different contracting parties. So sometimes the gods are named. the god Marduk, or the god Shin, or whatever the god happens to be. And then finally, there is the last part of the covenant, which is a series of blessings and curses. Blessings if you keep the covenant and are faithful. Curses if you don't keep the covenant and are unfaithful. And so there are these kind of 6 major parts to an ancient Near Eastern covenant that we find repeated in a number of examples that we have of ancient covenant texts. So covenants then are these solemn promises, either between individuals or cities, and they're made binding by oaths. And by the time of Moses, this sort of standard form was already in effect. And this is the form that seems to have been used by God with the people of Israel when he made covenant with them at Mount Sinai. All of these elements are very much present. In fact, there's a very strong argument that the entire book of Deuteronomy is structured after these 6 major points of covenant. We're not doing Deuteronomy in this class, but just sort of keep that in mind, and I wouldn't be surprised if when Deuteronomy comes up another few days that you may talk about that. In this case, Yahweh is the great king. He is the suzerain. Israel is Yahweh's vassal and is expected to be faithful. In the book of Exodus, what we run into then is a text called the Book of the Covenant. So when you begin reading Exodus this afternoon and tomorrow, kind of watch out for that phrase, the Book of the Covenant. These are the initial laws that God gives to Moses, and they address a variety of things, including slavery and injury and protection of your property and that sort of thing. All of these are recorded in the Book of the Covenant, which you find in Exodus 24. Then, in the establishment of this covenant, Moses is going to involve the people in a blood ceremony. Now, this is going to be a really memorable kind of thing because the whole congregation of Israel is going to be assembled and there's going to be a great altar. Moses is going to slaughter a number of animals and catch all the blood in basins. So you got these big bowls full of blood. Part of the blood is going to be poured out at the base of the altar to symbolize God as the party of the covenant. And the rest of the bowls of blood are going to be flung out over the heads of the people. So that represents you, and you are now in a blood covenant. Yahweh, represented by the altar, and you with blood running down between your eyebrows and over your nose. It's the sort of thing, it's like one of those Sunday morning services you don't forget. You know, it's like, gee, the pastor's gone over the edge now. I can tell. He's way out there. So these are bound together in covenant in this blood ritual. It's a fascinating kind of thing, and if you try to visualize it, it's pretty impressive. So God relates to humans through covenant. First with the covenant he made with Abraham, now with the covenant he makes with Israel. And how does this idea of covenant relate to what the New Testament is going to describe as the new covenant? You remember that on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he took wine and he said, "This is the new covenant in my blood." How do these ancient covenants relate to this action and speech of Jesus on the night of the Passover? Any thoughts about that? All right, his body is split, cut, bleeding. In a sense, more of a symbolic sense, I would say, there's a sense in which the blood comes over us too.
So the bread being broken, showing the
breaking of his body, yes. Like the Passover bread is broken or something like that? Okay, and cut in half, yes. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's interesting you use the term cut because the actual Hebrew language for making a covenant is not the word make. It is the word cut. You cut a covenant. That's the Hebrew language that's used in the Old Testament. You cut a covenant because it involves the cutting or dividing of an animal and the catching of its blood. So even though when you come to faith in Christ, you don't stand in the nave of the church and the pastor pours blood out over your head, nonetheless, there's a sense in which you are, as we sometimes say it, covered by the blood of the Lamb. That's where that language comes from, is from this ancient ceremony. Any other thoughts about ancient covenants and what is called the New Covenant? Wouldn't one of them be lordship? Who is your Lord? In the ancient suzerainty treaty, the great king is the Lord of his vassal, and in the Christian sense, Christ is now the Lord. No one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit, but still there's this language of lordship which goes back to these ancient rituals. Okay? Yep.
Could we say that they're stepping out of something into something?
Yeah, enlarge on that. What?
So these covenants prepare the way for a new covenant in Christ. You're not in you anymore, you're in Him.
Okay. Yeah. You're okay.
He provides a covering, therefore protection.
Okay. Sure. Yeah.
And
And therefore we owe him allegiance and obedience.
like the rainbow goes over and there's two sides to it,
Okay.
but it connects both sides.
Yeah.
Somehow that would normally be connected.
Sure. And even the very language of covenant itself, if we didn't have the old ones, we wouldn't actually know what was meant by saying it in the sense of Jesus' words. You have to have that backlog in order to make sense of this language. Yeah. So yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Are these new covenants like layered on top of each other, or are they kind of like trump cards? You know, are they?
Very good question. They are, I guess I should preface this by saying you will find different opinions about that, of whether they're layered or they trump. One concept is that the new covenant replaces the old. Okay, that would be more like a trump card. Another way is that the new covenant fulfills the old, which is more of a layered kind of idea, that it takes what is old, but it embraces it and brings it forward, but in a new way. Now, depends on who you're talking to as to whether you're going to read that. Okay, so even the Protestant reformers didn't entirely agree on that particular issue, but they did discuss it. For myself, I am not of the opinion that the new covenant replaces the old, but that the new covenant pulls forward into itself content from the old and then makes it full in a new way. So I'm on that side of the argument, but you do find both sides within the Christian community. So that's a good question. Well, we'll skip that one. The covenant of Moses, very much, as I mentioned, like the structure of Deuteronomy. So I'll just briefly go through this. The book of Deuteronomy begins with the expression, these are the words, which in Hebrew are ha'ela ha'devarim. These are the words. It's the very same thing you find in the other covenants. And then a historical prologue, and then some general stipulations, very specific stipulations, the deposit of the document. When you get to the witnesses, however, obviously the witnesses between Israel and God are not going to be the respective gods, because there is no other God except Yahweh. So what Yahweh calls for as witnesses is the heaven and the earth. The heavens and the earth stand as witnesses to the covenant. And then finally, there is a lengthy section in Deuteronomy called the blessings and curses, which you'll probably get to a bit later. Now, I think I'm going to pretty much, for time's sake, pass over this link of language of blessing and cursing, but just look at the similarity, at least briefly, between the covenant of the Assyrian monarch Esarhaddon and the covenant in Deuteronomy, and look how similar the blessings and curse language is. Esarhaddon says, just as rain doesn't fall from a copper sky, so may there come neither rain nor dew upon your fields. That, of course, is if you break covenant. And in Deuteronomy, the sky over your head will be bronze. The Lord will turn the rain of your country into dust and powder. And as you go down through them piece by piece, you can see that the language is extremely similar in the blessings and cursing sections of these covenants. So let me ask you, does it surprise you that God would use an ancient Near Eastern form of covenant as the basis for his relationship with his people Israel? How much do you think God uses cultural structures? Okay, give me some examples. How does God use cultural structures?
Worship with electric guitars.
Now that worship with electric guitars. Okay, I'm trying to picture this in the heavens scene in the book of Revelation with the angels and the four living creatures and the multitude surrounding, and then you have the praise band. Well, that's a thought. I usually tell people you need to learn to appreciate liturgical worship because that's the kind you're going to get in heaven. It's the only kind that's described. But you may not want to buy that just yet. You may have to get old like me before you can appreciate that.
Dan?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
that's me.
After you go through this, I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on the covenant in Genesis 15.
Yes,
In
where Abraham arranges the animals.
Right.
In Genesis 15, there is a covenant-making ceremony in which God initiates a covenant ceremony with Abraham and tells him how to prepare for it. He's going to take animals and he's going to cut them. Back to this language. He divides the animals and puts them in kind of a semicircle. And then typically in ancient Near Eastern culture, when you did that, you and the party you're making covenant with would walk between the pieces of the animals to confirm your covenant. But in this case, God does not walk with Abraham. He causes Abraham to go to sleep, and God passes through the pieces as a smoking fire, which seems to suggest that the real responsibility for keeping this covenant is going to be on God himself rather than Abraham. In other words, Abraham is not going to have to do a certain number of things before it happens. God is going to do this of his own gracious initiative. And so this is a unilateral covenant rather than a bilateral covenant. God himself is the one who's going to make this happen. So I think that's the essence of that covenant, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Liturgical as in like a very, like a way of worship that's been ordered a specific
Yes.
way?
Yes.
Okay.
The description you have in Revelation is the liturgical setting. And that's why ancient churches adopted liturgy, is because that's the way it's described in the book of Revelation. So if you go back to the 2nd century, for instance, in the way that Christians worship, they're going to worship liturgically because that's the way they saw it in the book of Revelation. And whether that, I was speaking tongue-in-cheek about heaven. I mean, I don't know what heaven's going to be like, you know. So maybe there will be a praise band, and who knows? If there is, I hope I get to play bass. So. Anyway, let's see here. Now, the last half of the book of Exodus is primarily about the building of the tabernacle and about the worship that was connected to the tabernacle. I am choosing to bypass that discussion primarily because I know that Chad, who's going to be with you next week, is going to talk about it in a good deal of detail. And so it's kind of overkill for me to spend much time on the tabernacle. So I'm going to really skip that part. But I do want to go to this slide that says the salvation story that began with Abraham and continues with his descendants occupies the remainder of the Old Testament. The things that we have been talking about today, Abraham, his response to God, the sacrifice of Isaac, the building of the 12 clans of Israel through the sons of Jacob, This is going to set the stage for the rest of the whole Old Testament. That's why this area is so very, very important, because it is stage setting kind of thing. And the rest of the Old Testament really is going to depend upon what we've talked about here. The overwhelming conclusion at the end of the Old Testament is this: Israel, God's chosen people, have been unfaithful covenant breakers. That is the overwhelming conclusion. They did not make the grade. And it is out of that failure of Israel, which in the larger sense symbolizes the failure of the whole human race, it is out of that failure of Israel that the message of grace takes shape. The law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So I think that's a really important idea. Israel, as a failed nation, is no more than a symbol of the rest of the whole human race, which are failures as well. And so what God does to save Israel, He does to save us all. And He does that through faith in Jesus Christ as the children of Abraham. No one was righteous. Each one in his own way has turned away from God. That's true of you, that's true of me, that's true of every human. There is one overarching conclusion. Humans do become aware of the problem of sin in the law of Moses. And so, as Paul says, the law was given to make sin extremely sinful. Now, that's an interesting expression, isn't it? The law was given to make sin extremely sinful. Do you think most people think of sin as sinful? My general impression, people think that sin is not bad. It's just, oh well. But Paul says that this is given to make sin sinful. And it's out of sin being very sinful that we are ready to hear the grace of God. The way I would say it is this way: if sin isn't all that bad, then grace isn't all that good. It's precisely because sin is that bad that grace is that good. And it is grace, of course, that comes through Jesus Christ. So, that brings us to the end of what I want to do in Genesis and Exodus, which is kind of just a real quick skim over some really important ideas and a lot of things that I haven't discussed. But you have the rest of your life to read about those things. And I'm hoping that you will. I am going to let you out 12 minutes early, which itself is kind of a miracle. Don't expect it to be repeated very often. It's been a delight to be with you today. God bless you all.
Well, Dan was going to let you out a few minutes early.